let's start. This time I'm going to introduce myself and I'm going to present. So thanks a lot for being here in another seminar. Today I'm going to present one of my current projects. Actually, this is a great timing for this paper because I just got back from Journal of International Economics this Saturday, and we got a revise and resubmit. So now I'm going to get back on this paper. And basically, this is a paper with one of my friends from Minnesota, and now he's assistant professor at Rutgers University. It's a paper that we call Expansionary Fiscal Consolidation under Sovereign Risk. So the usual disclaimer applies, as this project does not represent the views of the World Bank Group. And let me start with the motivation of this paper. And actually, I started thinking about this paper after talking with some of the government counterparts in the Philippines, like in 2022 or 23, where they were saying that the Philippines during the COVID-19, they increased public debt almost by 18 points of GDP. And they were expressing their concerns, and they were saying, oh, how can we achieve fiscal consolidation without sacrificing economic growth? No? So this is not only true for the Philippines, it's basically true for most of the economies in the aftermath of the pandemic. And the question is, if there is any institutional arrangement that could contribute to achieve fiscal consolidation or to reduce debt levels without sacrificing growth. And the idea of this paper is that with fiscal rules, we can achieve this, because basically the idea of this paper is that with a fiscal rule, it will be possible to achieve fiscal consolidation by the direct mechanism that is imposing some debt limit and forcing the economy to reduce debt levels, right? But at the same time, and this is what this paper is about, this debt reduction implies a reduction in the sovereign spreads, borrowing costs. This free up resources for the economy that could contribute to attract investment and boost capital accumulation and economic growth in the medium long term. So basically, what we're gonna do today, or what we do in this paper, is sovereign debt model with private domestic investment, long-term debt, and fiscal rules. Just to give you an idea of what is the literature on this, usually most of the sovereign debt literature only have short-term debt, and the papers that have long-term debt, they don't have capital. So one of the main contributions of this paper is to put capital and fiscal rules, and basically the interaction of these two give us another channel through which fiscal rules can contribute not only to fiscal discipline, because that is already well studied and well documented, is more on how the interaction between fiscal rules and investment can give us another channel that will contribute to have higher accumulation while achieving fiscal consolidation or fiscal discipline. Okay? So basically, the mechanism in the model, and just the intuition that I want to give you, is having default risk introduced to distortions in the economy. One is basically underinvestment, right? Because if there is default risk, as an investment, I know that there are some states of the world in which the government gonna default, then the economy gonna be in some recession, and then my returns on my capital will be low, right? And because of that, then I will invest less than what I will invest in the case where there is no default, right? And this is very common, like in emerging economies. And then the other distortion is what is called in the literature debt dilution. Debt dilution, and this is happening when you have long-term debt. And basically, what this means is when a government issue more debt, basically the bonds that I have from that government will depreciate, right? Because the more debt the government have, the value of those bonds will decrease. So basically, the value of those bonds will be diluted, right? So this is what is called debt dilution. And basically, the idea of the paper is that with with a fiscal rule, we can actually mitigate both distortions. Not completely, but we can reduce these distortions basically because when you put a debt limit, basically you are putting an upper bound on the debt dilution, so that increase the price of the bonds, right? And this also contribute to reduce underinvestment. Okay. Um, so this is I'm gonna show you this in the paper.
Because also you putting a debt ceiling in some sense, like amount of debt I can undertake is also going to reduce my default risk. Is that already a
Yes.
mechanical?
Sorry, I think I didn't mention that. Yeah. So when you put a debt ceiling, you're gonna reduce the level of debt. If you reduce the level of debt, you reduce the sovereign risk. If you reduce the sovereign risk, basically you reduce the distortion that makes me invest less than what I want. No.
Yeah, I can see that in a world where there's complete foresight, but you could also imagine a situation, right, that the government decides to take on more debt because there are some opportunities, investment opportunities available for the government where the variance on the return is high. Okay, and in some states of the world, my debt taking on by the government is going to be super beneficial because I'm going to be in the scale of the distribution where I get very high returns. Consequently, I'll be able to meet my future debt requirements and blah blah. So in fact, in the end, my default risk goes down because my investment paid off. Right? On another state of the world, it goes completely other way. So are these just kind of like expected value terms I should think about, or the higher order
So I would say that the case that you mentioned is interesting, and actually Malaysia is a good example of that. Like basically the debt rule in Malaysia is such that you have some limit, but this is only on debt that will be used for other projects that are not necessarily development projects. So if you actually, I mean, in Malaysia, you can issue debt to finance specifically like development or capital projects, right? So in this case, we are thinking about debt rules that limit the amount of debt that you can issue, not necessarily to finance capital, right? Here, all the investments will be done by the private households. It is true that it could be the case that if the government is issuing debt to finance capital projects, then this is not necessarily true, right? Because then you are limiting the fiscal space to actually finance those projects. But in most of the cases, like most fiscal rules, there are some fiscal rules that consider this case like differently, right? Like in the case of Malaysia, and here we are looking more we are thinking more on governments that lack fiscal discipline and they just gonna issue debt because of political myopia or because of this, not necessarily to finance these projects, but definitely that could be something that can be studied also through the lens of this model. But I'm thinking more on the general case where basically here the government just gonna issue debt to transfer to the house just because they they might have a lower beta, whatever, but they don't do anything with these resources, but just transfer into the households. Okay. And finally, we're just going to present some empirical evidence that support the mechanism of the model. This is still with macro data. We are thinking for the new version to do it using firm level data, but for now, I'm just going to show this as almost anecdotal evidence only. So let me focus on the well. Let me just quickly go through the main findings. What we're gonna do in the paper is gonna show what are the optimal debt limits for the economy that we calibrate here. We're gonna use data for Argentina, and under those parameters, we're gonna find what is the optimal debt limit. I mean, the number is important, but what is very important is the intuition, right? Because we're gonna show that the importance of the debt limit is that it cannot be too stringent, because if it's too stringent, it's gonna limit the government and it might generate welfare losses. And on the other hand, if the limit is too high, it will be irrelevant and doesn't have any effect on the economy. So what is nice is just to see what is this trade-off. In the case of this economy, we're gonna show that basically with the optimal debt limit, you still get a little contraction in the first 3 or 4 quarters, right? Like a small reduction on investment, because in the first periods, the government has to reduce the levels of debt. So basically, you can think that they're gonna increase taxes, there's gonna be less investment, and there's gonna be a small contraction in the economy. But then after the implementation of the rule, sovereign spreads will reduce, right? And in the medium term, that will allow to free up resources, start increasing investment, start accumulating more capital, and then move to a stationary state where you have higher GDP. So overall, we show that in the baseline case, there are welfare gains. Later, I will explain exactly what this number means. We are using just the consumption equivalent measure of Lucas. And in the second part of the paper, we relax the commitment to the rule. Because here there is an interesting assumption, which is that this is a sovereign debt model that implicitly assumes that the government cannot commit to repay the debt. But at the same time, we are assuming that the government can commit to the fiscal rule. So to try to be more realistic, in the second part, we show that this also holds when you relax this commitment to the rule, and instead of that, we introduce something that is called agreement strategy, and it's just to say, okay, if the government deviate from the rule, then what happened with the private agents? What are they gonna do? So basically, overall, we show that the benefits of having a rule are so good that it's better not to deviate. Okay. But basically, most of the time, I'm going to be talking about the baseline case just because it's more straightforward. But then we're going to go back to the quantitative results. Any question? This was the fun part. Then I'm going to talk to the models. Of any question before I jump to the model? Perfect. Yes.
How do you deal with enforcement of the rules? Is that a question that you'll be addressing?
No, basically this is the part that we are assuming that there is perfect commitment from the government to the rule. So in the baseline model, they always gonna be enforcing the rule, right? In the case that there is no perfect commitment, they're gonna do it because strategically they prefer to enforce the rule than not enforcing, because otherwise, if they avoid the rule, then there's gonna be they're gonna move to an equilibrium where they are worse off. Okay. I'm gonna show that. So let me explain in detail the model. I don't know if you are familiar with this, so I'm just gonna highlight the assumptions that are not common in the canonical sovereign debt models, and also there are some assumptions that might look a little bit strong. I'm just gonna mention whether or not they are common in the literature, and then we can discuss. So basically, this is a small open economy with a continuum of households and competitive firm and a benevolent government. So households are identical, and they own the firm, they own the capital, and they are the ones making the investment decisions. A common assumption in the literature is that households cannot borrow from abroad, and in the sovereign debt model, all the borrowing choices gonna be made by the government, which is a benevolent government, meaning that they want to maximize exactly the same utility as the household, right? This is a strong assumption, especially when you have investment. So in the canonical sovereign default model, the households are just hand-to-mouth households. They only receive resources from the government and they eat. But here, they are the one making the investment decisions, right? In the referee report that we received on Saturday, they were highlighting this assumption. We have ideas on how we can relax a little bit this, but in general, this is very close to sovereign to the canonical sovereign debt model. But it's true that it might be a little a strong assumption. Then, as I was saying, usually the government borrows on behalf of the households and they can default on the debt. I'm going to show you this. And basically, the firms rent the capital from the households. And here the only uncertainty comes from this CT, which is going to be the productivity shock that's going to follow an AR1 process, right? And that's it. Then let's talk about the government. So, yes.
In the previous slide,
Yes.
Is there an equal sign missing in the first equation? Or
no, this is just the preferences of the household. So basically, what they want to maximize is the expected lifetime utility. No.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So the government gonna borrow from international lenders that gonna be risk neutral, and basically they're gonna lend as much as the government want, as long as the expected return is compensate the risk of default of the government, right? The key of these sovereign debt models is that they can endogenize the default probability of the government, and they can endogenize the domestic interest rate or sovereign spreads. So basically, the long-term debt matures at rate gamma and pays a coupon kappa on the remaining unmatured debt. So basically, the law of motion is given by this expression, which basically means that the debt tomorrow, like BT plus 1, is going to be equal to the debt issuance today, whatever the government decide to issue, plus the debt that hasn't matured this period. So sorry, next period. Next period, the gamma PT is going to be the debt that matured that period, and the 1 minus gamma is the unmatured debt, right? So that's that BT plus 1. That's going to be my total debt next period. So the governing constraint on the governing budget constraint will be given by this expression, which basically means that what the government has to do is they have to pay back debt, right? Which basically is the debt that matured that period plus the coupon that they have to pay on the unmatured debt. And they can also choose to make some transfer to the households. If this term is negative, they can also get some lump sum taxes. And to pay this, they can issue more debt. So that is the government constraint, the government budget constraint. And finally, the fiscal rule is just a correspondence that maps the state of the economy into the policy set. And basically, here we're going to be looking only to debt rules that are basically debt limits. And here, what this is saying is like the debt limit will be either, let's put a number here, like 0.4 of GDP, right? Represent 40% of GDP, or in case that the initial debt level is already above of the debt limit, right? Then the rule will be at least not to issue more debt, at least to pay whatever is gonna mature next period, okay? So later we're gonna relax this and we're gonna say, okay, the government can, if you are above the debt limit already, you can have a small deficit, or we can play with that. And that is thinking a little bit more on what is called in the literature like medium-term fiscal plans, right? That maybe you're Argentina and you're already very in debt, you are not expecting to reduce the debt a lot in one period, right? You maybe want to do it smoothly in 5-10 years. Yeah. So we can play with that. So basically, in these models, the government can default at the beginning of each period, right? And if that happens, the literature assumes the following: the government will be excluded from international financial markets, but there is a re-entry probability, which is gonna be theta. And when the government re-enter to the markets, they're gonna re-enter with any liability. Okay, this is also a common assumption. There are papers that say, no, this is not really realistic. We can do partial default, and then it implies renegotiation process. But just to keep it as simple as possible, we're gonna assume this. And another assumption in the literature is that when the government defaults, there is an exogenous default cost. That basically it means that the productivity in a default state will be smaller, right? And this is gonna be the default cost. And basically, this functional form is asymmetric, just in the sense that the default cost will be higher in states of the economy where the productivity shock is very high. And this is just a trick of the literature to try to mimic the fact that countries tend to default more in bad times and not in good times. So basically, with this functional form, because epsilon 0 is going to be negative, so when this is too high, basically this number will be positive. So the exogenous default cost will be so high that the government don't want to default in good states. But when this is small, basically this will be higher than this, and basically this term gonna be higher than 0, and then in this case the productivity shock for the exogenous default cost for the government in bad states is not too high, so they're gonna tend to default in bad states of the nature, which is what we observe in the data. Okay.
Is it temporary or the persistent shift in the productivity?
Sorry.
It's a temporary shift.
It's just basically it's a temporary shift in the productivity while you are in default.
And
When-
then it like goes back to the normal level, or
If you re-enter to the financial markets, yes.
oh, I see.
So there have been some papers that try to rationalize this instead of doing this trick. The most famous one is by Enrique Mendoza and Vivian Yu. And what they do is they introduce working capital. And what they say is that, like most of the firms need working capital from abroad. And basically when a government defaults, like they cannot get this working capital from abroad, and basically this introduce some distortions at the firm level, and that's what explain what we observe in the data, which is that in default periods, the productivity and GDP drops.
I see. So make sure I understand. So the default state has some persistency because of the theta, right? So
Default state has a process.
persistency, because default state that continues with the perpetuity.
Yes.
State,
Yeah.
So the productivity shifts down until the
Until you get a good realization of this, that makes you re-enter to the financial markets, and then your productivity is back in the normal one. Okay. I mean, the productivity is always the same, but what you have is this exogenous default cost that shift down the productivity. Yeah. So finally, the timing will be basically that the governments wake up and they observe the state of the world, which is given by the initial level of debt, BT, the initial capital stock, KT, and the productivity shock, CT. With this information, the government decide whether or not to repay previous debt, BT, right? And if they decide to default, then there is nothing else to do for the government, right? If they decide to repay, then they can also choose the new level of debt for the new period, and also the transfers that they're gonna make. So basically, they choose what we call fiscal policy, right? And then after the government moves, the households gonna observe the policy GT, and they're gonna decide consumption and investment decisions, right? And basically, once this happens, lenders are gonna observe what is the policy, what is the aggregate investment, right, of the economy, and with the aggregate investment, with the new level of debt decided by the government, then they're gonna price the debt, basically just by adjusting the probability of default, and then we're gonna get the price of the debt. Okay.
Sorry, one thing I missed was when you wrote the government observes the state. What is the state of the world? What is the state variable that it's observing?
So it's CT, the productivity shock.
It observes ZT, okay?
CT,
Yeah.
and the initial level of debt, PT,
Yeah.
and the initial capital stock of capital stock,
Okay.
KT. Okay.
Okay.
I'm gonna have it in. So let me just move quickly to. Yeah. So this is the state of the government. X has the capital B and capital K. Okay. But first, let me quickly go to the recursive formulation of the households. I'm gonna explain in detail this, and then the others is just straightforward after this. So basically, for the households that they're gonna move after the government decide the policy G, right? So the aggregate state is gonna be the same, CX, and X is given by the initial level of debt, initial capital stock, and then households also gonna take into account like the fiscal policy G, right? So assuming that we are in a state of the world where the government decide to repay debt, right? This is the problem of the household. So basically, what they have to do is they have to maximize the utility from consumption today plus the expected value of the expected value of the utility of the future utility, right? And this discount by the discount factor beta, and basically the utility in the future depends on what the state of the world you are, right? Because if the government tomorrow decide to repay, then D prime will be equal to 0, right? So you're gonna be in this state of the world, and you're gonna get your value of being in a repayment state, which is basically this, but evaluated at the state variables of tomorrow, right? If the government decide to default, then you're gonna be in this state of the world, right? And your utility gonna be given by this value function HD, right? That it's gonna come from a problem similar to this, but evaluating in the state where the government decide to default, which is the next step, okay? So basically the constraints of the household is just the budget constraint, which basically what they can do is consume, they can invest. This represent just a capital adjustment cost that is a standard in the literature, and this parameter phi will help us to match the volatility of investment that is more consistent with the data, because otherwise the government could give you the model could give you an investment that is too volatile, that is not consistent with the data. And basically the income of the household is just given by the stock of capital of the household times the price of the capital, which is R, which is a function of these variables, no? Plus the profits, because remember that the household is also the owner of the firms, and plus government transfers, okay? So it's a standard. Here we have just the law of motion of capital, so basically we are just assuming that capital depreciates at rate delta, and basically this is what we call like the beliefs of the households, right? Like this is a belief function in the sense that the household believe that policy tomorrow, right, will be given by this function, okay? And in equilibrium, the belief function will be equal to the policy function of the government, right? So basically, the household believe that the fiscal policy will behave according to this function. Same for the other aggregated states, big K, big P, and same for the default tomorrow, okay? And basically the solution of this problem will be given by policy functions for consumption, for investment, and for the new capital stock of each household, right? This one in the aggregate will give you the aggregate capital of the economy. Is that clear? Any questions so far? So basically, now we still need to know what is the value of this HD, right? So let's look at the value of the household when the government decides to default. So basically it's the same, but I'm highlighting in red what is different when you are in default. So this is the case where the government at the beginning of the period, they decide to default. So if they decide to default, you're gonna be facing this drop in productivity, right? And basically your continuation value will be different than before, because in this case, you are already in default states. So if you get lucky, you can re-enter to the markets again, and if the government decide to repay, you're gonna be here, right? Otherwise, with probability 1 minus theta, you're gonna remain in default, so you still receiving HD, right? And there is another case that never happened in equilibrium, but just for completeness, we need to consider, which is the case where you actually re-enter to the markets tomorrow, but then the government decides to default, and then you are back in this state HD, and that will happen like theta D prime. That is the case. It actually never happened here because when you re-enter to the markets, there are no liabilities, so the government will never default in that case. Okay, just for completeness. So the solution of this problem, again, gonna give you policy functions for consumption, investment, and capital in default states. And finally, we go to the recursive problem of the government. So basically, the government has to decide whether to default or to repay, right? And that depends completely on what gives you, what is the higher value, right? Like the value of default, it will be given by BD. And basically, it's given by the utility of consumption today, evaluating with the policy function of the households, plus the continuation value, which depends on what happened tomorrow. So if I'm lucky and the government re-entered to the market, then you are back in that case, right? Both with probability 1 minus theta, you're gonna remain in financial autarky, and then your value will be still BD, okay? In the case of repayment, then the government, in this case, there is nothing to maximize because you decide to default, you cannot issue debt, there is nothing to do. In this case, the government has to choose fiscal policy, right? Has to choose the transfers, has to choose how much the new level of debt or how much debt they want to issue. So they have to maximize choosing G, right? And they have to maximize the utility for consumption today, plus the continuation value, right? Which in this case is gonna be this function B, just evaluating at the state of tomorrow, which is gonna be given by X prime, C prime, right? This X prime, remember, is the B prime that the government is choosing, and the K prime that is the aggregate of all the investment decisions of the households, right? And this is something that I'm gonna knew until tomorrow morning, okay? So basically, this is just the budget constraint of the government that I showed you before, and this problem gonna give you solution, a policy function for debt, and also a policy function for default. So this is a typo, there should be a policy function for default. And now we are done. This is the definition of the equilibrium for this economy, but basically it's just policy functions, belief functions, such that they solve the problem of each agent, and they are consistent. The policy function must be consistent with the belief function. And the only missing part that I haven't mentioned too much is the lenders. These are risk neutral lenders that they're gonna lend you as much as the government want, as long as they break even, right? So this means that this price of the bonds reflect the probability of default of the government, which is given by this D prime.
And isn't D a function of theta in some sense?
Sorry?
Isn't D a function of theta in some sense?
Of theta.
The fact how, like, because
in some sense,
But it's-
in some sense, yes, no, because
yeah, because that's what determines how likely I am.
exactly, because here you are deciding how much debt to issue, right? And you are also deciding. I mean, this value depends on theta, and basically the probability, your decision or default or not depends on these values, right? This one, there is no theta, no, this
There is
one, there is
theta.
theta, yeah. So just think about the extreme case in the autarky that basically is that theta is zero. Once that you default, you're gonna remain in financial autarky forever, and then you are making default very painful. So basically, the more painful is doing default, the less default you will try to do. If theta is like you default and tomorrow you are back,
Yeah.
then you're gonna default more often. So yes, definitely theta plays a role here. And then now let me go to it's already 1:44, so let me skip the mechanism and let me show you some charts and then we can have a discussion. So let me just take 2 minutes to talk about the calibration. We calibrate the model for Argentina, basically just because it's a representative emerging economy that is used a lot in these sovereign debt models, maybe because they default. So there are two kind of parameters. Some parameters we just take from the literature or from the data, right? Which are what we call the independent parameters. And we have some parameters that are calibrated internally by simulating the model. So this means that we're gonna simulate the model just to try to match some specific moments that we observe in the data. So in particular, the three parameters that we calibrate by simulation is the volatility of investment relative to, this is the capital adjustment parameter. And this capital adjustment parameter is calibrated to match the volatility of investment relative to the volatility of GDP, which in the data is 2.65. We get something close to 2.5. Okay. The other two parameters that we calibrate internally are the ones associated with the exogenous default cost, right? And these ones are calibrated to match the average spread of the economy, which is just the difference between the domestic interest rate and the international risk-free rate, which in the data is around 0.8 and in the model is 0.07. And our third moment that we are trying to match is the average debt level, which in the data and in the model is like 45% of GDP. Okay. And the rest of the parameters are either from the literature or from the data.
So the 6.25% is that I have a 93% probability of being able to access financial markets even after I default.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This all is quarterly. So basically, this 0.625 is equivalent to say that in the data for Argentina, we observed that I think it was every 16 quarters, like you remain in financial autarky for 16 quarters after default on average.
Okay.
So basically, this theta equal to 0.625 is trying to match that. Yeah. So let me jump to the first result, which is we compute. So basically, for different values of the debt limit, we compute the welfare gains using what is called the consumption equivalent. And this is just basically you take two economies. The one that we calibrate is in the case that there is no rule, right? And then we assume, okay, what happened to the economy when you introduce a debt rule? And we did that for each value of this, right? And then basically we compare in the ergodic distribution, we compare the, the, the utility of the households, and basically this consumption equivalent means like how much consumption do I have to give to the household living in the world without rule every period, so that they are indifferent between living in that world without rule and in the world with rule. If this transfer that I have to give is positive, then it means that there are welfare gains because the guys living in the world with rule are better off. If that number is negative, it means that actually having a fiscal rule gives you welfare losses, right? And what this chart is telling you is like when your debt limit is too stringent, right? Remember that for our economy, the average level of debt is 0.445, I think, yes, exactly. So if you put a debt limit that is too far away or is much more smaller than your average debt, it's going to be very painful for the economy to achieve this fiscal consolidation. And basically, the government has to mobilize a lot of resources. You can think that they're going to need to tax a lot from the households. Households going to have to sacrifice consumption, going to have to sacrifice investment. And in the overall, the economy the households gonna be worse off, right? Because it's too painful to go from 0.45 to 0.35, right? If your level of debt is around 45% of GDP, and you put a debt limit in 60, 70%, then you don't want to have any effect, right? Because then the debt limit is useless, okay? So I think that is what is interesting about this chart. And especially, I mean, in terms of policy, what is interesting is to think what are the parameters that are key to get this value, no? I mean, just quantitatively, in this case, our optimal debt limit is a little bit below the initial level of debt, but not too much, and the welfare gains that you get are around 0.50%, which is like a standard number in this literature. Any question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is this the findings of your study?
It's one of the results, yes.
One of the results.
This is what we call the expansionary fiscal consolidation. So basically, this is just all the paths for the main macro variables. So let me go quickly one by one. So the first one is debt. So basically, the economy was around. So this is the x-axis is years after the implementation of the rule, right? So basically, the debt decrease after the implementation of, I mean, like, remember that in the model we have quarters, right? So basically, since the first period after the implementation, you start decreasing debt, but it doesn't drop immediately below the debt limit, because as I say, doing that is very costly in terms of welfare. And remember that we allow in the model that when you are above the debt limit, maybe you don't need to go down immediately, but at least you cannot issue more debt, right? You cannot run deficits. So basically, 1 year after the implementation of the rule, the new level of debt is already below the debt limit. And basically, they keep reducing debt, because something here interesting is that you also don't want to be too close to the debt limit, because if there is a bad state, right, then it can push you to the zone that you are already above the limit. So especially in this case that we have commitment, like the government wants to be far away of the debt limit, right?
Can I ask a very silly question? Maybe just I was a bit now like caught in a circle. Like, so if the government is benevolent, right? It is a social. It wants to maximize the well-being of the households, right? So what rule? Why do we need a rule at all? What prevents the government from always choosing the optimal solution? Is it to in this model? What is the rule? What is the purpose? It's sending because it wants to send a signal. I was just maybe I've missed something.
No, it's a good question. So basically here the problem is like it's time inconsistency, right? Because there are two things. One is like in general in these models,
Yeah.
you have a low beta. So if households and government are impatient, right? I mean, you need this just to generate positive levels of debt and mimic the data. If you don't have a small beta, you cannot rationalize that, right?
Okay.
And the other is that then you have a time inconsistency problem because it's like, okay, I want to maximize your utility today, but then tomorrow, like I need to optimize, right? And then because this lower beta, you always tend to increase more debt, and this have like the debt dilution problem, and it has the default risk problem. So basically, is buying commitment against this time inconsistency problem. That is what.
So then governments are not fully rational in that sense.
Um,
The agents, but
I would say that this is, we are looking only at the Markov equilibrium. If we
Yeah.
are only caring about yesterday, you are not looking at the whole like history, and in that sense, it's not fully rational. If you want to say it like that, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so basically, so for capital, for investment, it looks similar in the sense that you're gonna, after the implementation, because you need to pay back debt, you're gonna pay it by reducing consumption and by reducing investment, right? By reducing consumption, by reducing investment. But then after 1 year or a little bit more, then you are back to the same level or even a little bit more, right? So for capital, you can see that that also decrease, but then you start accumulating again more, and this only 5 years. But basically, I think I have the same. No, yeah, no, sorry. And then you are getting back to the same state, to the same value. Sorry. Then for default state, we see that it decreased because basically what happened is that with the rule, you issue less debt. The lower debt, the less probability of default. So basically, you are actually defaulting less. And then, yeah, I mean, same trade balance move completely the opposite in investment because these are the times when you are actually repaying back debt. So you have a surplus in the trade balance. And well, the only one that is important also to mention is spreads. So basically, after the implementations, there is a drop on the spreads, basically because it limits the debt dilution. So basically, this is reflected in better pricing of the debt. So that means lower interest rate or lower spreads. And then even though later you're gonna start, no, forget, okay. So I only have like 5 minutes. Let me see if I want to say something else quickly. Yeah, so just to quickly talk about the case of the fiscal rule without commitment. So basically, the assumption here is that we relax the commitment. So before we force the government to enforce the fiscal rule, in the case without commitment, we relax that assumption and we are not forcing the model to actually obey the rule. But what we are saying is that, okay, instead of that, we're going to assume that the government can deviate from the rule anytime he or she wants. But once that they deviate, the investors will play a grim strategy in the sense that if they deviate, then the investors don't believe in the government anymore, and then the price of debt and everything else will be back to the equilibrium without the rule, right? So when that happened, basically, so the result that I want to highlight is that welfare gains are even higher, right? Because in the case without commitment, is even like having a rule gives you even more benefits, right? Because in the case without commitment, the prices of the debt, the spreads are even higher. Then when you can have this rule, basically the two distortions that we mentioned, which are the underinvestment and the dilution, are even higher in the case without commitment. So when you have a rule, like the benefits are even higher. So let me, so basically in the empirically, we just do some local projections using macro data, and we find like so similar dynamics, but they are not really statistically significant. That's why we need to look at firm level data, which is the next step of this project. And then just concluding, let me just so saying that so I think the main message of the paper is to explore this mechanism between investment and fiscal rules, and how having fiscal rules can not only contribute to fiscal discipline, which is already something well studied, but also can have an effect on the price of debt and basically on other variables such as capital accumulation and private investment. I think I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to discuss if you want to talk 5-10 minutes more, or otherwise we can do it outside. Yeah. Thank you.
Just a quick question. So I think you have mentioned about the short run costs. So the consumption went down 5%.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about is there any way to avoid those kind of problems by thinking about the counterfactual when the announcement and the implementation period is not the same. So announcement comes first, later on the implementation comes next, and then they might be more like a smooth adjustment and maybe on the state variables, so that you could have smoother path in the consumption maybe.
I think, I mean, we haven't done this, but I will say that the way to do that is what we can call a medium term fiscal plan. No, like saying it's here we are just saying okay, you have two options, government. Either you reduce debt below the debt limit, or if you're already above, at least don't issue debt. But if you actually give more flexibility to do this, let's say, okay, let's reduce this, but in 5-10 years, then that can help you to smooth this the fiscal consolidation, right? Because I don't know if it's gonna give you more welfare gains. That is something that we need to evaluate. But definitely there is a way to avoid this costly transition. What I don't know if that is welfare improving or if that gives you more welfare gains than what we are doing right now. But it's something that it can be explored. Yeah. Anything else?
I just have a quick question. In the idea of the debt, are you looking at it from the central debt or from the total debt perspective?
We are using total public debt, yeah, from the WIO, general government debt.
Okay. Do you also consider that in the model, investment being constrained to the private investment, while in reality, investment happens together with government perspective? So what will be the justification for restricting the investment just to the private?
You are saying why I'm only looking at private instead of total investment?
Yes.
So I don't have a good answer on top of my head. I think it was, I mean, just to keep the model as parsimonious as possible, right? Because, I mean, we already have 3 state variables, and if you also allow the government to make investment decisions, then it's adding one more state variable, and then computationally becomes very challenging. But yeah, other than that, I don't have a good answer. Also, I don't know if that will change the intuition of the results. I need to think deeper about it.
It would be good to explore that. And I'm also thinking one more. Investment and debt, they are jointly determined. Do you factor that in the operation? Because oftentimes when you take investment decisions, oftentimes it goes along with the decision because debt financing also plays a role in the financing of the investment. Or do you just assume that they stand alone?
No, I mean, as I mentioned before, definitely public investment is very important to invest specifically like in infrastructure projects and this. But also, like if you look at the composition of total investment, like private investment definitely is still the main component, at least in most countries. And I think here, like when if you put a fiscal rule and if you think about what will happen to the government if they can also invest, basically, if you put a fiscal rule, you are constraining the fiscal space for the government to actually make investment projects, investment decisions. In the model, what it's telling you is that, okay, maybe the government cannot invest, but then the private agents will invest. Of course, if the government is playing a big role in the investment decisions, it's not clear what effect will dominate. I mean, I think it's something that can be that we can look at the data, and if it makes sense, we can try to introduce to the model. But right now, we are not really talking about that. Yeah.
But I also think a better way to justify focusing on investment that is private. If you look at Argentina, the economy is it driven more by private investment? I think so.
Just
Yeah, I think so. That would be a good justification from the perspective of Argentina.
I mean, I think in most countries, like the private investment plays a bigger role than public investment. Yeah. Professor.
This is a cluster of questions because I haven't worked out what the real question is. First, can the government lend to individuals? I haven't quite worked out. You said private individuals can't borrow, but can the government essentially borrow a large sum of money and just give it to the individuals? Or is that ruled out?
Yeah, that is what happened here. Like, because the households cannot borrow, the borrowing decisions are made by the government, which is benevolent, so they have exactly the same utility function, and that's why we have these transfers. So,
right. Yeah. That's what I understood. Can you model this with an interest premium, which is different from private individuals to the government? So one of the reasons that classically a government would have a deficit is that it doesn't tax people, but that's welfare raising and people borrowing a much higher interest rate than the government. So could you model this with an interest rate premium between the private borrowing rate and the government borrowing rate instead of this blanket ban?
Definitely, I mean, that's,
Or has that been done?
no, I mean, it hasn't been done it hasn't been done in the sovereign debt literature. So basically, instead of having a government that do all the borrowing decisions on behalf of the households, having some firms that also can borrow and basically also look at the what's the word of this? I mean, the difference between the pass-through of the default risk to the corporate default risk, like Luigi Boccola has a lot of papers on that. We have been thinking on how to relax this assumption that the firms cannot borrow. And one way would be to introduce like firms that can borrow or some kind of banks. It is possible to do it. I don't have a clear way right now on how we do it, and specifically, I don't know how the results will change. But definitely something that we are planning on at least to explore. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, can I just follow that up?
Yes.
Is there uncertainty shocks on the households, which are different from the uncertainty shocks?
Also, in the paper that I'm thinking about the Bucola, no, it's basically the same shock for I mean, there is only aggregation.
Because Woodford, in one of his early papers, argued that it's the idiosyncratic shocks on households which make government debt, because then they have paid less taxes. And as you know, once you pay taxes, you wave goodbye to the money. But if you have a government debt, you can use that to solve idiosyncratic shocks.
Okay.
But that's not in here either.
No.
Okay.
No, but it's a good point. Yeah, I mean, we can talk.
We're working on that.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so let's finish here. Thank you very much. And I think we still have one more seminar this month, and then we'll take a break. Okay. So thanks a lot, and happy to talk more if you want having a coffee outside. Okay. Thank you.